Hi Year 13s, I hope you're all keeping well and safe. Now this video is primarily for those of you who are unable to attend Monday's session. But I will also outline towards the end of the video the work that you all need to do over the summer holidays so that you're in a good position when it comes to September to begin writing your NEA. And the summer holidays is really an opportunity for you to make the most of the 6 weeks off to get ahead with your reading so that it is not too hectic when you get back in September. And so it's good to get ahead of the game now, and also to ensure that you're able to begin writing your NEA as soon as possible when we get back in September. So on Monday, in Monday's session, we went through the three different historical inquiry questions that you'll be able to choose from when writing your history coursework. The first question is a causation question. The partition of India in 1947 was caused primarily by the actions of the Raj. In the context of 1857 to 1947, how far do you agree with the statement? Now, what we were doing on Monday then is we were critically sort of unpicking and deciphering each of the three coursework questions, each of the three historical inquiry questions, and our main aim was to understand what each of the questions entails for you as students when it comes to writing them, so that you're in a position to sort of make an informed choice about which question you should pick. And so, in relation to this question, the historical concept is causation. And this question last year actually had the sort of the highest grades. This question, the people who answered this question, the students who answered this question, got the highest grades last year in comparison to the people who answered the other two questions. So this was firstly a popular question last year, and it has been a popular question over the years at Lambton, and it also tends to attract the highest grades amongst students of the three coursework questions. So the historical concept is causation. We're really focusing here on the different causes of partition over the 100-year period, beginning with, of course, the 1857 Indian Mutiny, and how that had consequences for British rule in India, in the sense that immediately afterwards, in 1858, the British Crown took formal control over India from the East India Company, and the British actively sought to implement and institute a policy of divide and rule to break the unity, the sort of unified anti-colonial nationalism they saw in the Great Rebellion between the Hindus and the Muslims, that they needed to break down this unity, break down this anti-colonial nationalism, and pit religious communities against each other to ensure that they could strengthen and bolster their own rule. So one of the things I did on Monday was explain this question with the classic iceberg example. And so the tip of the iceberg, the part that sits above the water, really represents a narrow surface level understanding of partition and its immediate causes. So we're thinking about things like what happened, what choices were made, by whom, who was affected, when did it happen, and where. And some historians who argue about the causes of partition, they tend to fall in the trap of explaining partition as an event in 1947 through its immediate causes in what we call the turbulent 40s. Okay, they tend to sort of contextualize partition as an event in relation to the 1940s and how that was a turbulent decade, which had the inability of leaders to cooperate, Mountbatten moving the date of partition forward from July 1948 to August 1947, and they really situate the cause of partition, the trigger of partition, in these 7 years. And what we need to do instead is think beneath the surface. So what are the deep-seated causes of partition which can be located across the 100-year period? Now, I've already explained how 1857, the Indian Mutiny, the Great Rebellion, sort of kickstarted or triggered this process of or paved the way towards partition through the institution of the British divide and rule policy, a key sort of a key crux of its British imperialist rule in India. Um, and so we need to think about what factors influence the particular choices made by the individuals and groups involved in this event. And of course, then it is important to ensure that we cover the whole 100-year period. One of the pitfalls that students had last year was there, and where AO1 marks sometimes can be deducted by the AQA exam board is when students fail to cover the chronological date range comprehensively. So all of the decades between 1857 and 1947 need to be mentioned. Okay, they don't need to be mentioned all in the same amount of detail. Some decades will only require slight comment, but all of the decades really need to be mentioned to cover the chronological date range and to ensure that AO1 marks can be maximised. And another sort of diagram which illustrates the causes of partition can be the sort of trees and branches diagram. So the causes, the root causes, the sort of different causes which lead to the eventual problems which arise in the 1940s, and that paves the way for the British implementing a policy of partition in 1947. And the symptoms are not really what we're concerned with at the moment for this question, because those would imply that we're looking at the consequences of partition of India, which of course relate to the post-independence period, post-1947, all the way up to the present day. But it's important to think about the fact that the partition of India in 1947 did have consequences for India as a nation state. Does have consequences for India as a nation state today, and these symptoms can sort of be related to the legacies of colonialism in South Asia. Now, there's a multiplicity of factors which cause partition in 1947. So the different sort of causes, the umbrella terms that you can use for your different factors when it comes to completing your A3 table over the summer holidays. You've got British imperialism, so divide and rule. You've got communal tensions between religious communities, and you've got the inability of religious leaders to cooperate. So you will need to think about how you can link any of these causes together. You'll also be required to think about which cause is the most important and why, which cause is the least important and why, to ensure that we've got this thorough understanding of causation as a historical concept. You might alternatively argue that a combination of these causes were necessary in causing partition. That all of these factors can be equally weighted in importance and are all necessary simultaneously in leading to the partition of India in 1947. The second question is also a causation question. So in the context of the years 1857 to 1947, how important was Gandhi in achieving Indian independence? Okay, and similarly, I use the iceberg example. So the tip of the iceberg is a narrow surface level understanding of independence and its immediate causes, but we really need to look beneath the surface and look at the deep-seated cause of independence, which can be located across the 100-year period. And here we really need to think about the differences between independence and partition. Okay, now independence is different from partition, and they deserve different definitions, of course. Now, independence is the granting of autonomy, of self-governing provisions by the British across time, across the 100-year period through their democratization program, but it's also part of the wider British Empire project of decolonizing in the sort of mid to latter part of the 20th century. And so in many ways, historians argue that the independence was inevitable, that independence was bound to happen at some point, that Britain could not always hold on to India as part of its empire in the foreseeable future. and that Britain was basically battling to hold on to India for as long as possible, and that decolonization was, of course, inevitable, that the granting of independence by the British to the Indians was bound to happen. Partition, however, is a policy developed by the British to ensure that independence is granted to the various different peoples and the various different sort of autonomous states in South Asia. So you've got the creation of the nation states India and Pakistan, and the policy of partition is primarily the line sort of drawn by Sir Cyril Radcliffe to outline the borders between the newly created nation states India and Pakistan. And partition across the period 1857 to 1947 was not inevitable. Okay, some historians argue that it became inevitable in the 1940s with the failures of the Cripps mission in 1942 and the Cabinet mission in 1946, as there was sort of no real last resort then, that the British had tried all means to seek a constitutional settlement for all of the various sort of religious communities in India, and this was not possible, and therefore partition was the only solution at the time. But again, this is a policy really brought forward by the British because they see no other alternative. And so, whilst independence is, of course, spoken about by Lord Montagu, for example, in 1917, in his speech entitled The Montagu Declaration of the Gradual Sort of Development of Self-Governing Provisions for the Indians, in the sort of 1920s, partition is by no means inevitable in India, and therefore the differences between the causes of partition and independence are different. So, for the cause of independence, we have the existence of independence movements and figures, anti-colonial nationalism, which predate Gandhi's arrival in the Indian political scene. So, the 1857 Indian Mutiny is also titled the First War of Independence. There were figures and there were independence movements, which sort of which precede Gandhi's arrival on the political scene in 1915. There's decades of history between 1857 and 1915, whereby obviously the Congress was created, the Muslim League was created, and the Indians mobilized to engage in various anti-colonial rebellions and anti-colonial nationalist movements across India as a country. You've also got then Gandhian politics, his campaigns and his satyagrahas. So his early Gandhian struggles from 1917 to 1918 in Champaran, Kheda, and Ahmedabad, where he takes up the struggles of the local people in those various different regions, and then that really allows him to translate those localized movements into nationwide movements with his non-cooperation movement beginning in 1921, and you've also got then the civil disobedience movement in 1930. You've also got a consistent British democratization program across the period with the 1861 and 1892 Indian Councils Act. You've got the 1909 Morley-Minto reforms, the 1919 Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, and the 1935 Government of India Act. Okay, so it's really, really important to explore how those eventually built up momentum towards independence. Alternatively, you can think about whether the democratization program introduced by the British was really for the independence and sort of autonomy and self-determination of the Indians, or whether they were merely to placate the nationalists and to bolster their own rule. And lastly, you've got World War II, which accelerated the process of decolonization. So, of course, Britain were drawn into the Second World War in 1939, and India was no longer financially affordable or viable as a colony to the British because their economy had also been depleted back home, and they had exploited the Indian economy and their resources. So India was also drained in the sort of immediate post-World War II era, and therefore the British had no alternative but to decolonize at the time. Of these two questions, though, the two causation questions, this one and this one, I would strongly recommend that you answer the cause of partition question over the cause of independence question, just because of the fact that the partition question throws up a more historically engaging debate, and various arguments have been advanced in relation to the cause of partition by um, many different historians, and it is a much more historically engaging topic and inquiry question to pursue um, at your stage at year 13s. It is also an easier question which has in the past got higher marks than students who undertake this historical inquiry. And so I would recommend the partition one over the independence one. The third question is based on change and continuity across time. So how far do you agree from the years 1857 to 1947 that the British worked consistently to create a peaceful, prosperous and self-governing India? And so you'll be thinking about seeing change as a process rather than an event. You'll be looking at the way in which the rate, pace and extent of change over time differs. You'll be thinking about how factors acted to affect the process of change. You'll be thinking about whether the British project in India was ever consistent. So were there consistent attempts to create a peaceful, prosperous, and self-governing India, or can the nature of British rule in India be characterized or contextualized otherwise? And so your themes will be peacefulness, prosperous, and self-governing. Okay, and you will need to define and explain the keywords in the question in your introduction to ensure that examiners and the readers of your NEA know what you're defining the key terms as, and also so that we know the criteria upon which you're judging each of these themes. So what constitutes peacefulness, for example, or consistent attempts by the British to create a peaceful India. And similarly, that goes for the same with prosperousness and self-governing. Now, there's two approaches to consider when planning your response. You can either take a chronological approach or a thematic approach. So you can plan your answer in relation to covering the date range from 1857 to 1947. But as we discovered on Monday, this does have a few pitfalls and traps. You need to be conscious to avoid falling into large and long passages of description and narrative. You will need to ensure that you sustain that argument, okay? And that argument is outlined in your introduction. Ensure that it's threaded throughout all of your paragraphs and reinforced in your conclusion. Alternatively, you can pursue a thematic approach whereby you look at each of these different themes and tackle each of these different themes individually and sometimes in conjunction simultaneously across your essay, but then you're jumping between the date range and different decades. So some things for you to think about. What are the key themes that the question addresses? How can we define each one? How can we explain each one? And how can we define consistently? Now, this is just a meme that I'll put in to make you aware of the fact that all of these three questions require a sustained argument. Not sure if author understands the difference between a narrative description and an actual argument. You're seeking to sustain an argument, a coherent argument, throughout your essay, and that will help maximize your AO1 marks. Okay, your AO1 counts for 20 out of the 40 marks for your NEA, and therefore you really need to think about that argument that you'll outline in your introduction, the argument you'll consistently come back to throughout your paragraphs, your main body paragraphs, and the argument that you'll then reinforce in your conclusion. This website is brilliant. It's an electronic library for free ebooks and journal articles. So if you click on this website and you type in a book title, you'll be able to download books and copy it to your iBooks if you have an iPhone. And you'll be able to download them as PDFs. I think you might be able to do this on your laptops as well. And then you can read these PDF documents and start highlighting the relevant areas that are appropriate for your inquiry question. These are just two guideposts, sort of guidance for for the historical concepts that the three inquiry questions focus on. So the conceptual focus is really what we're driving behind our argument, and it's important to think about the 5 points here for causation and consequence. Obviously, you're just looking at causation, and the 4 sort of guideposts here for change and continuity. Okay, and so these guideposts really help you think about the nature of your argument, and how and what sort of approach to the question that you'll be pursuing, and what you will be arguing throughout your NEA. So I hope that's helped in terms of an introduction to the 3 different historical inquiry questions. Of course, if you do have any questions, please email me on ndesi@lambton.org.uk, and I'll be able to respond even at times during the summer holidays. But now I really need to explain to you what you need to do over the summer holidays, and this is really important. So according to the books that you've already been provided with, and the books that you'll be able to look up through that website, which provides free ebooks and journal articles, I will also put up some readings for you as well. I've got an NEA readings folder, and that is split among all 3 inquiry questions for you to look at. You need to fill in this detailed plan. Okay, so this detailed plan is for questions 1 and 2, which focus on causation. Okay, and here you'll put your factors and your causes. You'll place your factors and your causes here. So, for example, if you're looking at the partition question, you'll place your causes such as British divide and rule, so British imperialism. You'll put the inability of religious leaders to cooperate, and communal tensions on the ground, for example. Okay, so you've got the actions of the Raj linked to that British imperialism. So what we mean by actions of the Raj is the actions of the British viceroys, the governor generals at the time in India, actions of state authorities run by the British in India, and also policy devised in Westminster in UK Parliament towards India. And what you'll be doing through your reading is finding evidence in support of this factor or cause being important in leading towards partition, in causing partition. And then you'll be looking at evidence which challenges this cause. So you'll be looking at evidence essentially for and against each of your causes holding weight, being important. And then you'll be looking at quotations from your reading which support or challenge each of your causes, okay? And that should be placed here. And when it comes to providing quotations here, the author, the book title, and the page number will be incredibly useful here, because when it comes to referencing for your NEA, that will just make things easier. In this column, you'll be thinking about how important this factor is, okay? So you'll be weighing up the relative significance of all of the different causes that you've discovered. Is one cause, for example, more important than another, and why? Is one less importance, and why? Or are they all equally weighted? Is a combination of factors, for example, necessary in leading to partition? And then in this final column, you'll be looking at sort of placing each of these causes into the chronological time period, the 100-year period. So which time period does this factor relate to? Does it relate to sort of the whole 100-year period? Does it relate to, for example, the 1920s to the 1940s? Or really was it consistent throughout the century? Now, if you're aiming for an A star on A, I think you should all attempt to do this anyway, because it will help you think about your NEA when it comes to you writing them. Think, which of the causes, if any, is the most important, or are they equally weighted in importance? Consider the following questions. Which cause is the most important and why? Which cause is the least important and why? Or, alternatively, were a combination of these causes necessary over the 100-year period to trigger the event we are concerned with, and why? If you do believe that the event was caused by a combination of factors, how did they link together? What links can be made between them? And this is really important. Similarly, this is the detailed plan for question 3, the change and continuity question, whereby you'll place your themes of peacefulness, prosperity and self-governing here. And then you'll be looking at evidence to support the argument that the British consistently ruled to create a peaceful, prosperous, self-governing India. Evidence against the argument that the British consistently ruled to create a peaceful, prosperous, self-governing India. You'll be looking at quotations from your readings to support and challenge each of the themes, or your argument for each of the themes, and then you'll be coming to a judgment. So what is your overall argument about the nature of British rule from 1857 to 1947? And it's really, really important that you think about change and continuity here, because you may be able to contextualize or characterize a certain period of time between this 100-year period of the nature of British rule, but that may change over time. Okay, so the way in which we characterize British rule from 1857 to say 1900 may be different from the way in which we characterize British rule from 1900 to 1920s, and that may differ then from the way in which British rule establishes itself on the ground from 1920 to 1947. And then you'll be looking at the 100-year rule, assessing change and continuity over time in relation to the three themes in the question. Okay, so do the British work consistently to create a peaceful India over the 100-year period, or are there changes over time? Is there a period of peacefulness and then a period of violence, oppression, and brutality, and then does it going back to being peaceful? So you need to look at the rate, pace, and extent of change over time with all of the themes. And so similarly, you need to think about the rate, pace, and extent of change over time, seeing change as a process rather than an event. Which factors and how factors acted to affect the process of change. This is perhaps the most important thing. You must critically decipher the term consistently. You need to unpick this term. Were the British consistent in their attempts to create a peaceful, prosperous, and self-governing India? If not, how else can we contextualize the nature of British rule in India? Okay, and this will form part of your overall argument. Were there any elements of consistency in the British project in India, or was policy often reactionary to events on the ground in the subcontinent? In other words, was policy developed on the hoof, which means without preparation or without thought, or was there often a clear sense of direction in the development of policy? I hope that's made things clear, Year 13s. If you've got any further questions about what you need to do over the summer holidays, or you're having trouble picking an historical inquiry question, please do drop me a message on Google Classroom, or you can alternatively email me. But these detailed plans do need to be complete by the time that you get back in September.